This program has been approved for one IDCEC CEU. To receive credit for this program, please submit your full name, IDCEC number, program class code, and your summary essay to ceu@iida.org. The program class code is located alongside the title of this program on the IIDA Academy page. For a certificate of completion to use toward another certifying body, please submit the same information to ceu@iida.org. Thank you.
Still legitimately say good morning since it's 11:30. So good morning, everybody. How are you?
Good morning.
Fairly convincing. My name is Cheryl Durst. I'm the Executive Vice President and CEO of IIDA, and it's my pleasure to welcome you this morning to Season 3, Episode 4 of Collective Design, and this is Collective Design Live. We will not charge you any additional Netflix fees for not living at the same address, because that's a thing now. If you were in the first session, the keynote this morning with Amy Webb and the Future Today Institute, this is a bit of a deeper dive with a phenomenal panel, and it's going to be led by my friend and moderator of the panel, Bryan. I'm going to tell you a little bit about Mark. He's a senior Foresight manager at the Future Today Institute, where he leads the built environment, hospitality, retail, restaurants, and CPG practice. Prior to joining FTI, Mark worked as a workplace strategist, designer, design researcher, and futurist for clients across the country, most recently through his role as Director of Innovation and Research and Senior Interior Designer at Columbus, Ohio-based M&A Design. Mark's portfolio of clients includes national retail brands, higher education institutions, nonprofits, multifamily developers, and large corporate clients. Working with his clients, Mark brings an understanding of the principles of psychology, culture, and human behavior that can shape and change the future. He's authored several white papers and developed research surrounding what leaders need to know about the future of workplace culture. Mark is also certified by UC Berkeley in using resiliency to combat stress at work. Please join me in welcoming Mark, who is going to introduce his panel for this brilliant session. Cheers, Mark.
Thank you. All right. Can you all hear me? Okay. Well, good morning, and hopefully everybody was here for Amy's talk. We're just going to take that and now actually bring some tactical level to what Foresight is, how we can start to think about where we're bringing it into our businesses, how we can use it to interact with our clients, a little bit more long-term thinking. So by show of hands, I always enjoy doing this, how many people here have been asked, what is the future of work? Okay. What about the future of retail? Healthcare? Multifamily. Okay, you see where I'm going with this, right? So the future is on top of mind of everybody right now. And it's because we just came through a really big uncertainty. And so what we're trying to figure out is how we can be better prepared. And that is what Foresight allows us to do. I, as a futurist, my background, as Cheryl said, is in design, really found that my clients were getting stuck. And they were getting to a point and they couldn't make a decision about how they wanted to move forward because they had too much information. There's infobesity is a term that's out there right now. They've got hundreds of emails that are coming their way, and they're trying to figure out, what do I respond to, right? How do we get to that funnel? Like, how do we get to the right answer and response? And so Foresight allows us to do that because it allows us to let our clients pre-experience the future in a way that makes it more tangible for them and makes it more manageable to understand what is the right way for them to act and to be able to choose what's right, but also still being fluid about it. And as Amy said in her talk, we as designers do that on a daily basis. We take the data that we know, we translate that into what the needs look like and what the possibilities are, and then we help them figure out what those futures could look like for them to be able to make choice. And so I'm really honored to be joined by this panel here today because we're going to talk about how we can do that a little bit more, again, from a manufacturer standpoint, from a design standpoint, as well as the communities that we need to be more responsible to when we're designing for them. So let me do a quick introduction of them. So we have Paola Aguirre. Paola is the founder of Borderless, a design and research practice based in Chicago and San Antonio, focused on approaches and collaboration frameworks addressing spatial justice and equitable design. So thank you for being here. We have Ryan Anderson. Ryan serves as Vice President of Global Research and Insights at MillerKnoll. His team leads MillerKnoll's research efforts, and their work focuses on how the places we inhabit can be better designed and managed to support positive and productive experiences. Thank you. We've got Todd Heiser with us. Todd is a principal and co-managing director in Gensler's Chicago office. With more than 20 years of experience in next-generation design, his expertise is regularly sought after by organizations, conferences, and global media outlets. So thank you for being here. We have Kaelynn Reid. Kaelynn is a certified design futurist at Kimball International with a passion for improving the quality of space for all by enhancing the built environment. She also hosts the Alternative Design podcast, where she discusses design possibilities that lead designers to make decisions for a better human experience. So welcome.
Thank you.
And then last but certainly not least, we went in alphabetical order there if you couldn't tell. We have Elise Valoe. Elise is the Director of Research and New Business Innovation at Steelcase, a global design and thought leader in the world of work where they design and manufacture innovative furnishings and solutions to enhance the workplace environments for user experiences. So again, thank you all for being here. And I'm sure everybody's really excited to hear what you have to say. I think about Foresight in terms of taking the data and then again, translating that into the possible plausible futures. I would love to just open it up as a discussion where we talk about what you all see as Foresight, what's relevant to the design industry, and maybe even how you're starting to think about it within your practices. So I'm happy to volunteer people, but if anybody wants to go first, I'm happy to let you all jump in. So Ryan, how about you go first there, since you're sitting right next to me here?
Sure. First, hello everyone. Privileged to be with all of you. Thank you. Yeah, so as it's been mentioned, I have the privilege of leading the global research team for our whole family of brands. Foresight work for us looks at basically taking a glance at all the key trends happening in the world and trying to imagine different scenarios or different outcomes that might happen in the future. It's specifically a process called scenario planning. And the goal, as was discussed earlier, isn't necessarily to be predictive. It's to just iterate through different thoughts on where things are going. The more you think about it, the more you can test it, the more you can use it as a vehicle for debate and conversation. So it's kind of a due diligence thing in some ways, but it's also fun. We've been doing this a long time. Previous to MillerKnoll, I led research at Herman Miller, and I think one of my very first roles there was being involved with this in 2012, and we crafted these scenarios on how the future might unfold. It changes the way you look at things. It just gives you new lenses. For those that was here earlier, it's like seeing that cow in that picture. You just begin to pick up on things happening in the world that allow you to respond in a more thoughtful way because you've thought about them in advance and you've used it as a vehicle for allowing, for us, it's both our leadership, but also our customers, architecture and design firms, and others to think through this with us.
Yeah. I can follow next. So our practice has a very strong investment in how do we think about the future of the built environment. And I'm particularly interested in social infrastructure. Right? How does it look like to imagine the places that we're going to share? We do a lot of public work. We work a lot with governments. Raise your hand if you have worked with government, please, to share like the anxieties and the frustrations that come with working with public sector. But it's important to be in those spaces. And I think what's challenging about Foresight and the tools that we choose and pick to work in those spaces is how do we argue, how do we advocate, and how do we create collective visions? It's not an I, it's not my space, it's not my office, it's not my house, it's our public realm, it's our schools, it's our health institutions. So we think very often, how do you bring different perspectives? How do you create a sense of collectiveness? And the most challenging of them, how do you align in values? We cannot move an inch if we don't understand what is important for either of us, and how do we find a middle ground for that? So I'll leave it there.
Yeah,
I would add that I also think of Foresight as a guiding light. So to build off of what both of you have just mentioned, it is a collaborative effort that allows you to bring multiple industries as well as departments within your organization to all be focused on the same future that we would prefer, not necessarily like what's probable, but what do we want to create and make decisions today so we all achieve that and get there tomorrow.
I think there's a part of this too that I like to think about Foresight in some respects as this idea of accelerated serendipity, right? We want things to happen faster. And when people ask, if I'm at a design firm and they ask, what's the future of retail? What's the future of workplace? And I think what we're trying to do is we're trying to find answers through iteration in a really quick way. And the thing that I think is interesting about, being here on this panel, I've often been saying, well, the why of a space, a why of a place is the idea of peripheral intelligence, right? It's that when we come to places like this, when we engage in actually exactly what we say, iterating on the future, we actually gain peripheral intelligence. We know more than we went into a situation. And I think what's happening in our cities right now around kind of design and what design can do to change spaces, this idea of foresight, futurism, and peripheral intelligence is really important because you need a lot of minds in a space to push a project or an idea forward.
I would say that I think the emotional connection is something that we as designers have an incredible opportunity to be able to foster. So in order to be able to take any of those action steps, which is the beautiful part of Foresight, is not just imagining the future or storytelling or fortune telling. It's actually being able to take actionable steps towards a shapeable future that we want, but you have to create the emotional connection first. And so to be able to visualize that, and as designers, we are visualists, right? So being able to translate that visualization for our clients and for our stakeholders, getting them to emotionally connect to that type of future that is preferred is gonna help us to be able to work backwards to take the steps that we want to get there.
Yeah. So I think the common thread that I'm hearing is it's about bringing multiple voices together. It's about bringing everybody to the table to understand their insights, generating that common value and making sure that we are building that narrative together. So that way it's not just one voice. And I think that's something that's a little bit different in the design industry when we think about, we used to start with the designers telling and shaping, here's what you should do, versus now what we're talking about is bringing in multiple different people to make sure that all stakeholders have a voice. So Kaelynn, I want to go to you for a second. I know you've been working on building Foresight within Kimball International. I would really love if we try to take this to a tactical level, just like if we're thinking about starting points.
Yeah.
What are some of the risks and opportunities with having bringing this into the practice, as well as having a more future-minded kind of outlook?
Yeah. Well, I would say first it's getting stakeholders to understand what it is, right? And that it's really a secondary research practice. So I think the struggle can be that it can sometimes feel like you're just doing the what if. It's the imagination. It's telling really great stories and then landing there, right? And so I think being able to have the opportunity to explain that this is actually grounded in data, which businesses have already staked their claim that is the most valuable commodity right now is data and research. And as an industry, we so value evidence-based design. So being able to come with actual data, actual research to be able to understand what the future could look like and understand how to move forward, I think is a challenge to get stakeholders to really understand that is this foundational component. Because I think once you get that buy-in, there's an incredible opportunity, as we just discussed, to bring more voices in from different departments, to be able to have more of a collective voice that's going to bring more equity, more diversity, more voices to the table. So for us, I think right now it's looking like trying to find the data, I know has been a challenge for us, and just trying to look at alternative sources, right? So how do we get out of the design echo chamber, if you will, and really start to look at maybe the not so obvious answers and the not so obvious clues, like what Amy was discussing in the keynote earlier this morning, of what's that negative space and how do you identify that is definitely something that we're continuing to pioneer at Kimball International for sure.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think a lot of the clients that I worked with, again, they got stuck because they had so much data, and sometimes it's the opposite true, where there's not enough data where we can figure out how to make that right decision. And what you're hearing us talk about is we're creating the plausible preferred futures when we're talking about using Foresight. And again, as Amy said in her talk, there's not one future because the future unfolds in many different ways because data looks differently when you think about the different convergences and how they come together. So part of what responsibility is when we're thinking about Foresight is how we can manifest those convergences in a way that's relatable to our clients so that they, again, can see themselves in that future. But you said something that's, I think, really important, and maybe we'll go to Elise here just in a second. Where's the data coming from? And how are we making sure that these are built on research and evidence versus just speculation? And that's a really critical point to understand. What we're talking about here is not just, I heard something, and so now this is what's going to happen. We here, and I'm going to use the collective we here, spend usually weeks, months, sometimes years researching a topic or an idea to understand what that future looks like. So this is a very big part of the practice. The data on the front end is really important. So Elise, as we're thinking about, you and Bryan do a ton of research, but from where people are going to be working, where they're going to be living, where do you all start to source some of that front end data that people could use when they're starting to think about building foresight into their practice?
It's important for us to look outside our industry, outside of manufacturing, into different verticals, and to also look at different partnerships. So at Steelcase, we've had a foresight practice for decades, longer than I've been with the organization. So I do have the benefit of building off existing relationships and existing networks we have around foresight. We've been partners with Institute for the Future, with yourself, with Santa Fe Institute, Singularity University. We have really strong partnerships with academics as well. We've been members at the MIT Media Lab. That relationship has been invaluable for many, many years because we get early access to emerging technologies, and we can understand some of the trends before most people in our industry even get to see the technology. So a lot of generative AI, a lot of the synthetic data that we were talking about in the last session, we have early access to this information, and then we get to play with it. So we're great at prototyping on ourselves. We are a community of designers and researchers that love to translate these insights into built experiences and then prototype it. So we've done experiments with immersive environments, so understanding what does work look like in an immersive, completely in-world experience, prototyping it with teams who would do their daily stand-ups within VR to understand, does it really help with the ease, equity, and engagement within a meeting? And it doesn't. So we understand not only what's coming out through our partnerships, but we also build these trends into our spaces to learn how might it impact our future before we would recommend it to a customer and make large investments into something. But going back to the first point, it is a collaborative effort. You can't do it alone, and you can't just look inside. You have to really be looking outside more broadly, globally, and keeping your eyes open for those spots where you may not really think there's anything there.
So I want to just touch on the trends part, because I think we sometimes get lost in trends in the design industry, where we continually try to elevate ourselves and meet where everybody else is, versus taking that data, the trends that we're talking about, and translating them in a new way that is more inspiring and maybe more relatable. How do we know when a trend is right and maybe when a trend is wrong, if that makes sense?
For Steelcase, it's the prototyping of it. So understanding if a trend is trendy, right, or if it's actually going to be have a longevity and have actual impact and maybe even gain momentum in the future. We do refreshes on our Foresight Future of Work perspective every 2 years. And we have certain forces that we call them forces, not necessarily trends, that we track to see how are they gaining momentum or are they not. And when we do think that something may be actually solving for real user needs, then we'll start experimenting it. But if it's hype or if it's trendy and you're not really seeing the there in that trend, then we'll just monitor it with secondary research. So for me, what I've learned over the last 10 years of doing foresight research is just me personally, not Steelcase, is that if something doesn't really look right or feel right and you're not seeing what is this actually solving for, it just seems to be more like a frosting or a layer on top of something that makes something look good and not actually has substance to it, then you just monitor it, see where it goes.
I was going to say.
Well, I'll just add, maybe some of you have heard of the hype cycle, which is something that Gartner, the tech research firm, puts out. It's kind of a fun way of looking at emerging technologies. I won't give you a super long explanation of it, but it charts how in the early days of, in this case, an emerging technology, there's kind of some interesting things that you note, and then it gets really, really hyped. That's why they call it the hype cycle. They call it the peak of inflated expectations. And then the part that follows is called the trough of disillusionment. I don't know who named this, but I love it. But it's basically like all that stuff that's super hyped we should get in the habit of doing a gut check and saying, do I really believe this? So like I have a chance to host our podcast Looking Forward, and we covered metaverse at the end of last season. I got to tell you, and by the way, we love kind of different opinions. We like debate as a form of research methodology. Most of my team doesn't think that we're going to be working in metaversal experiences, super immersive VR experiences anytime soon. I think having a historical perspective and looking at all the predictions in the tech world that have turned out to be, well, they were tech certainties that turned out to be absolutely false, give you kind of a gut check on it. Again, not to say that we don't necessarily know, but whenever the industry, interior design, furniture, commercial real estate, get super locked into something, we should all take a step back. There's this, I'm going to get really meta here for a second, but there's this German philosopher, Schopenhauer, who once said, the goal isn't to see what nobody else has seen, the goal is to think what other people aren't thinking about that which everyone sees. We use it all the time. Like my team, we won't use generational frameworks for any of our research. The Gen X, Gen Y, Gen Z, as it applies to workplace, has proven to be a terrible predictor of behavior and other things. It's really tough, but you got to sometimes just step back and go, I just don't believe it, and stick with it.
That look back to look forward is really, really great.
Yeah, there's a lot of historical talk in our team. We'll get back to Bureau-Landschaft. We'll get back to other historical movements and go, what did or didn't work here? Because it gives you a trajectory on where things are going.
But I would have to say that while I also believe that possibly work will not take place in a metaverse, all of the time that people are spending in the metaverse today will impact their expectations and how they work in the future.
Totally agree with that.
So we need to really understand, how does entertainment, how does gaming, how are these other industries, how does being immersed in information in a different part of your life will bring those expectations into work, and that we do need to.
And you look at Web3 and how the technology can impact it. Yeah, totally agree. Don't take what I said too far. I mean, like I said, we have to do a gut check on our stuff too, and thankfully we've had such tremendous growth in gaming that seeing how gamers use our product is a wonderful look at the future, but still, we kind of need to take a measured approach. I don't think we're going to be ditching offices for working in Horizon Workplace anytime soon.
But I like what I'm hearing about being intentional. Who's this for? What is the goal? What is the impact that it's meaning to create? I think those are important reflections and questions, because sometimes we're in this work and I go. Stop, pause. What is this? Who is this for? What is the intent? What impact is going to make in this population or this population? Design is not available to everyone. That's still a reality. Design is still a luxury. It's a privilege. How do we work with that as a reflection in our work?
I think that's really important, because the places that we work and live are going to dramatically shift. And when you think about actually everything we've gone through over the past few years, I think the idea of foresight and futurism allows us to think about marginalized communities and how you can empower those marginalized communities to learn from them, right? If it's just a bunch of designers going into a place saying, like, we've done some research, we understand what the future is going to look like for you, it generally renders really poor results. But I think actually if you actually learn from the people that are in a place, and you actually employ techniques that ask, what is the future of work going to look like, and where is it going to occur, I think that actually starts to render some really interesting outcomes.
And not being afraid of those outcomes as well.
Exactly.
I think it's hard to, because you have stakeholders, and so if the built environment is analog and that's the future, like, oh well, that's terrifying for for us, right? And so, but we've talked about this before. It's how do you not be afraid of those answers and not being afraid of data or the research, right? I mean, we have to embark on that, knowing the brave journey of we may not get the answers that we want, but that's okay.
It's very scary when you think about cities or the places we practice, and understanding like, cities as we know it could dramatically change because of futurism and foresight. So what are they going to become? And I think that's what design solves for.
Definitely.
So a couple of things you're hearing here. We talk about building futures. There are two sides of it. So one is the trends, which are the things that we can know today because we have the data for it. What you're hearing up here, and what you heard a lot of the conversation talk about, are uncertainties. Uncertainties are the things about the future that we cannot know. But based off of the data that we have today, those trends, we can start to come up with, again, those plausible futures, using community to help validate what we're talking about, using it to give us the other insights to make sure that we can figure out, is that something we need to gut check ourselves on? Is that something we should be prepared for? But it's not a moment of stopping. And I think that's where a lot of people get stuck, is like, so what do I do with this uncertainty? Go back to the data, use the trends, break out of the bias that you've got for yourself, break out of your echo chamber, and start to figure out, okay, so what would the eventualities, if this were to occur? So if you're here, I'm going to reference Amy's talk. Hopefully you all saw it. But ask the questions, what if? What if this were to occur? And then ask yourself, what's the next thing that would happen? That's how you start to get beyond that uncertainty. Again, using the data as part of it. And there's also something else that we're talking about here, and that's the human need. What is the human need for what we're talking about? Does it solve something that is a societal problem? And so, Paola, I'm very curious from your perspective. I've heard you talk about reigniting imagination and using foresight in a manner that helps build societal structure. So can you talk a little bit about how your practice helps facilitate that?
I wish I sometimes, 90% of the time, I don't know what I'm doing, but I'm very willing to prototype. Not prototype like objects necessarily, but prototypes processes. And that comes from, as a consultant, oftentimes we're valued for this expertise, right? And I think listening and getting to know who you're working with is very important. So I work with a lot of communities, that have experienced incredible amount or like the impacts of inequities. How do you even start a conversation about, let's imagine the future in 30 years when you're concerned about bringing dinner to the table. That is, the range and the gap on that is just tremendous, right? So how do you work with that space? And sometimes it's, okay, we need to design this in a way that it's not only an extractive process, like I just want data from you. No, hold on, let's see what can we exchange? What can you learn from this? How can we, design some type of training, some type of, capacity building project behind some of the groups that we engage with in communities? And I think it's a form of generosity in the practice. And I think that, that's not part of any curriculum. Whatever you see training for designers, that's not necessarily how we're trained. So how do we unlearn and learn new things that we want to see represented in design processes? So the other thing is like this careful calibration between what's analog and what's digital. We are incredibly reliant on digital tools, right? But not everyone has access to that. So how do you slowly, carefully calibrate? What are the tools that you have to design to engage in conversations that are very, in person? They need to be in small groups. They need to be, sometimes a walk and a talk, right? Like, how do we point at things that we are very familiar with? How do we imagine? What are the questions that need to emerge in that process for residents, for users, for students, for staff of public institutions to imagine other possibilities? So there's not a template. For me, that's the difficulty of practice. Like it's not a cookie cutter. I always have to really listen, reflect, question, and then this is a toolkit. Like there's some things that we have already available, but it's very custom. Thinking about what are the needs, and again, going back to the question of impact, like what are we trying to do here?
Yeah. Kaelynn, your thoughts on just some of the other tools that are out there? Because I think what we're talking about is being responsible to our communities, but giving them a voice. So any thoughts on tools for foresight?
Yeah, so I love the fact that there are, in fact, tools to facilitate the conversations, because I love what you just said about the fact that it's an information exchange, right? It can be easy for us as designers to come in as a subject matter expert and say, I've thought about all these things, I've done all the research, here's, what we should do. And of course, moving forward in a way that's going to be an exchange and bringing more voices to the table. And so I love that, there are foresight tools that really allow for the facilitation of, active and engaging workshops that, can bring these voices to the table. And so I like the structure a bit of, the foresight tools that, we can use and really leverage, just because it allows us to get our brains sort of unstuck. I mean, Mark, we've talked about this before, that your prefrontal cortex is actually pretty wired to think that your future self is a stranger. And so that makes it really hard when it comes to thinking about anything transformational about the future. And so I find that a lot of these foresight tools that we have to work with allow us to break through that barrier of that prefrontal cortex and sort of get past the, I can't really think about the future, I can't really envision myself there.
Yeah, and it sounds like we're talking a lot about also just, this is a practice shift, right? This is not just something that's going to be easy, which is fine, because our industry as a whole hasn't gone through a ton of transformation if you think about what our process looks like. When we start with just doing some research, we've got schematic design that moves into concept, that moves into design development, so on, right? That process hasn't changed too dramatically much. What we're talking about up here is bringing in outside voices, being more long-term and not so short-term. And so, Todd, I'm going to go to you, because I've heard you talk about near-termism before. So, and how we need to break free from near-termism. So could you maybe talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you have to take the long view. And when you think about workplace or retail or where anything is going to go, I think right now we're caught into this moment of people asking us, what's going to happen right now? And I tell a lot of clients, like, listen, if you expect me to tell you what the future is going to look like, we probably should live in beta for the next few years, because there are going to be a lot of things around the world that are going to affect the way that we live. And so flexibility is key. If you're just thinking about how do I solve for a problem in 1 or 2 or 3 years, you know, you're going to come up with a short-term solution versus actually, I think, iterating. And I think every one of these manufacturers is thinking about iterating solutions that will define kind of the next generation of work versus actually the next kind of few years of what work looks like. And I think there's a comment that I really love about the only way to do that is actually to increase the number of voices that are in the design community. And so you can't actually, you've got to get out of kind of that short-termism by actually asking people outside of the design industry what things are going to look like in the future, because they're going to be, and I think this is really important, somewhat detached from the aesthetics of design, and they're going to focus on the function of design. And I think that I have this really funny thing that I think, like, design happens in 3 places and futures happen. They start at this place that is like wrong and ugly. And that's actually a really bad word for a designer to live in. But then they actually get to this place is that they're right and they're still pretty ugly. And then only they can evolve to this place, which is right and beautiful. And I think right and beautiful never happens if you're looking right in front of you. It only happens if you're looking 3, 4, 5 years down the line.
I just want to add one thing, because that was
Yeah.
awesome. If we could also get our customers to believe that they create the future,
Yeah.
that it's not something that you, even if you decide not to do something, it's still a decision that will create that future. So for empowering our customers to take action and actually start building their preferred future, that would be a magical
I
thing.
love that, and that I think, you know, obviously a lot of manufacturers here, and that you're buying design like a subscription. You're not actually buying something to set it and forget it. You don't do that in your house. You move things around, you shift things every single day. And if we started to think about the act of design, or design as a verb, and actually said you're not buying something to solve your entire future, you're actually starting to think about a palette of place, which is something you all use, to actually realize, like, this is going to change, and you need to think about the long-term iterations of how that is going to shift.
So let's get a little tactical with it then, because I feel like we've talked a little bit of the manufacturing side, but maybe let's talk about from a designer firm side standpoint, how Gensler's reach is tremendous. You all see the impact of the work that you do, both in the near term and then in the long term as well. So how do you get your teams thinking in this mindset, and maybe what are some practical tips for people who are wanting to also emulate that?
Well, I mean, I think, you know, our firm actually pulled the Research Institute out of the firm, you know, quite a while ago. And so we think about research as actually something that is attached but somewhat detached from the firm. I guess the first way I would kind of talk about it, how do you tactically do it? You hire interns. You actually really invest in people who are not necessarily coming through a traditional design process. So I'll kind of put a plug for IIDA through the programs that they're building, through our GAP program, through these apprenticeship programs. We're bringing more people to the party that don't come from traditional design education. We're also realizing that how do we employ research every day in our projects? I mean, that's really how innovation happens. And so we allow ourselves to break apart the process. You actually just talked about it, that we went through a strategy process, we would move into schematic, we'd go into design development, and then documentation. We force ourselves to now think more like a software development model, which is agile, and realize that very seldom do clients actually move in those processes that are very linear. They're actually more circular when you think about it. But inevitably, I think what we employ really is, another idea that Paola and I were talking about it is no one knows as much as everyone. So I think the design industry, where you may have thought originally like, well, this is Gensler, they're a large firm and they can do everything. And I think now thinking in a more bold and broad way about partnership and actually how you're bringing a lot of people together to solve a problem through, we were joking, I actually said, when you think about fashion collaborations or mashups in music, I think the design industry, is going to move to a model that is going to be more about collaborations to define the future and less about, a firm or a manufacturer, someone having all the information, because that partnership along with our clients are what really will deliver innovation and I think the future.
Go for it.
Yeah, I just want to talk a little bit about process. I mentioned before we use scenario planning. If this is something that you all would be interested in doing, the process is actually fairly simple. Identify a question you want to answer. Then next phase, start to get a bunch of information. And like I said, try to get competing opinions on where things are going. And then hone in, like Mark said, on those uncertainties. The uncertainties are what's going to cause everybody like, I don't know. Like that's the basis for saying, okay, let's come up with a couple stories. That's what scenarios are. Let's say the future relative to our question turns out this way versus this way. And then those stories become a vehicle for like debate and conversation. So if I said to you, picture the future, like I don't know what you would picture, but if I had you watch Blade Runner and then watch Gattaca, I bet if I asked you, which one do you think is more likely to happen, you could latch on to something tangible from those narratives and say, this doesn't feel right to me. So like right now, we're 6 weeks from finishing our current scenarios process. It's actually focused on the future of urban living and working in the year 2035. So we're taking a look at what's changing with cities. And we've done this. We've gotten tons of information. We're looking at what's happening in the global north, the south. What's happening in Lagos is very different than Copenhagen. And identified, and you've seen some of it, like what's going to happen with some of these buildings that don't feel like they're particularly environmentally friendly or desirable. Like that's an uncertainty. So where will this go? And then once we have the scenarios done, what we'll do, and I would recommend you do this too, is do the workshops internally first. Just get your own leadership team, your own people debating these things, thinking about it, and then we start taking them out. So like we will bring this to all of you. By the way, if anybody wants to join a virtual workshop, insights@millerknoll.com goes right to me. Like that's what we'll do. And then basically the feedback is actually the ultimate gold in that process. It isn't the stories, it's hearing what people latch onto and say like, this really resonates with me, because you'll start to say, all right, there's a couple different ways the future might go, but I have a clearer sense of how we can plan for these. And then you see them coming maybe a little sooner.
So I want to stick with that for just a second, because I know you do a ton of work with clients, as we all do, but you do a lot with scenarios. So how do you help them? Because sometimes scenarios seem a little, like you said, they can push boundaries. Some people think of them as predictive. How do you help translate that into business strategy for the clients?
Yeah, well, we start by saying, essentially, this is a way of being able to take in a lot of different trends without having to sit there and read trends reports. So I think people appreciate the fact that a good story brings a lot of like rich information together in a more memorable way. Then we explain, hey, this is not predictive, this is just provocative. It's meant to help us think differently and have a richer conversation. And then really it's about trying to get to implications that are specific to like, okay, you're a health system, you're highly distributed. What if cities, like let's say we see a major move towards suburban and exurban sort of living instead of city centers, what does it mean for you? And it's rich. I mean, it's nice for us to be able to have these conversations. We learn from them, but we're also bringing value. And let's face it, not every organization has a ton of capital to go redo their spaces right now. So it gives us all a chance to have a conversation about the future in a way that's mutually beneficial and maybe not super salesy. I had dinner with the board of the AIA actually last year, and I was putting the napkin on my lap, and one of the members said, when are you doing your next scenarios? I hadn't even met her yet. I'm like, did you like the last one? She's like, yes. One of the scenarios that we did in 2012 was basically, and it was heavily influenced by this guy from USC named Steven Weber, and he said to us, he pulled me aside, he said, listen, do you not see how people are rejecting anything that's institutional, and they're curating their own information feeds? They'll trust somebody that they know on Facebook, but they're not going to trust an authority. I'm like, I'm not seeing it, but this was 2012. And so we did a whole scenario about it. And then, it was one of those things where for the last 10 years, we've all been going, oh gosh, this is a little too close to home. Yeah, sorry.
That's super interesting. I would just add that scenario planning is very important for us to understand what is that future we would like to create, but also understanding our customers, the trends and the forces within their industries. So at Steelcase, we start with what are the key forces that our customers are facing, because each customer, as you know, their force is going to be a little different. Like in healthcare, AI may be impacting them slightly different than in social settings. So understanding which forces are the most important, and then layering those forces together, kind of like synthesizing them into those scenarios. And then the last part, which I don't know if any of us have mentioned, is building the artifact from the future.
Yes.
So if you can make some part of that future scenario concrete and real, there's more belief that you can actually move forward and make that whole scenario come out. So artifacts of the future, I know all of us here futurists have heard that term before, but I think it's an important aspect of that scenario planning.
Well, agreed.
No, I just wanted to go back to this idea of narratives and storytelling and how powerful that is for this work, particularly because we often come from a place of need, like I need this and that's immediate, right? Like you said, immediateness. So switching the paradigm of thinking in the immediate to, the future, that's something that allows us to, ask questions that are beyond that immediate need. So we work in a project, we'll describe it virtually, in collaboration with a organization that works in equity, racial equity particularly, and it was the people's budget, right? Like this idea of like, how do we design public budgets is unknown, or unheard in the US, but very embraced in other places. But I think that the US is making strides in recognizing that there's in collective power, there's a tremendous value, right? So instead of, coming from a place of need, we're like, okay, let's design the question that will allows us to go to multiple communities and spark more imagination of what's possible with money, right, with our taxpayer money. So the question was, what our communities need to be safe and thriving? Broad question. It's not immediate, but it helps us imagine beyond like police, healthcare. Like, what do you need to get here? And it could be in the form of infrastructure, could be in the forms of programs, could be in the form of all the services. But designing the questions helps to shift the narrative, and that was just a very important part of our process. And you bring along communities differently when we're trying to design these processes, and I was really excited to see the amount of conversations that sparked. And also switching from this idea of like data collection in a quantitative way to a qualitative way. So that the design of that question was so important because the answers that we were hearing and we were processing and reflecting on was very different than just like looking at city budgets, right? Like that's just going to get you, that's going to give you limited information. So the design of the questions in the process are so key.
Well, we probably know this, but qualitative data has a much longer shelf life. So the quantitative is nice, but boy, as soon as it's a year old, everybody's like, boy, that's old. Qualitative data can really last.
Yeah. I think what's interesting too is that foresight requires rigor. So in the pandemic, we actually, as a firm, our office here in Chicago, we decided let's not call it foresight. Let's think about it like jumping, right? And so we actually did these, we called them design jumps in the office. And on Monday at 4 o'clock, we would actually, in the center of our office, almost in a disruptive way, right, to actually break people from their focus. We would invite someone to come in and speak on something or a topic we wanted to solve. It's kind of like your scenarios, and we'd actually have the person out in the middle of the office. And we'd call these design jumps because we wanted to get someplace faster. We wanted to understand what the future would look like. And we started to do it every week. And we said, listen, we're going to do this every week because we want to build some rigor around kind of thinking about what the future looks like. And I think oftentimes futurism, scenario planning, it lives kind of in the ether. But I think what's helped us in a very tactical way is we said, listen, every 4:30 on Monday, we're going to put things down for an hour. And we're going to actually build a muscle, right, that actually allows us to constantly do this. And through that, if people see like, wow, this is a really interesting conversation, they won't need an invitation to join. They will actually just walk up and say something. And I think one gem for us as a design firm that is a very tactical thing is encouraging conversations and discourse to happen. And I think it's an odd thing to say, but I think when we were on Zoom for 2 years, that discourse did not happen because there was not actually the public kind of acknowledgement that, listen, futurism and foresight is happening here.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, I just want to add a tactical, practical thing, because I know you've been asking the practical stuff. So just in terms of scenarios and how we build those, I think what's really important is, of course, not only the narrative, but Paola, I love what you said about making sure that there's going to be winners and losers to each scenario that we build. And so understanding who is winning and who is losing, again, as our responsibility for being a designer and understanding who does the scenario impact. But there's a really great practical tool that we really love. We had a FutureX event recently in Detroit where we invited designers to come, and we asked what was the future of belonging in workplace, education, and healthcare. And what was great is that we didn't just stop at the scenario. A lot of folks think, you get to the narrative, you get to the story, you nailed it, you're good to go. But I really loved that there was a tool that we could use called Mapping Cross Impacts, where you're able to take the stakeholders and really write them at the top. And we asked designers, who are the stakeholders in your scenario? How is this going to impact them negatively and positively? And it really was just another great tool for us to be able to say, the scenario is going to impact everyone differently. Yep. And so how do we take that next level of responsibility to ensure that, how are we creating more equity? How are we making a better built environment for the folks we're designing for?
I think it's also amazing at how much, sorry, this is a good conversation.
I know, it's so good.
How much we can do digital modeling right now.
Yeah.
Right.
So Amy spoke about it briefly in the last session, where you can essentially build a digital twin.
You could simulate scenarios.
Exactly, of any physical environment and insert environmental, how much lighting, what are the pathways of people, who is going to be in this space. So essentially, you can model out these human interactions with space and technology before you even break ground. So taking that scenario, building it out synthetically, and then understanding, essentially de-risking it before you actually build it.
Yes.
Is an amazing tool for futurism now.
Yeah. So one quick comment, and then a last question, and then we'll move to Q&A. So we often talk about what is the job. Whenever we're thinking about the future, whether it's a trend report, whether it's a scenario, what is the job of what it is that we're producing? Is the job of the scenario to motivate? Is it to scare? Is it to help bring in collaboration and making sure that everybody's on the same page? That's an important question to ask when you think about whatever future work that you're doing. And also to recognize that scenarios is not the end point. That is not the end of foresight work. Saying the future of X, that's great. If it doesn't lead to action and you don't do anything with it, that you basically did just a really great, creative, hopefully generative exercise, but not creating that muscle where you're then taking that information and doing something from it is that important next step. So I've got one final question. It's unscripted, so forgive me for this one. But I'm going to talk about ROI for a second.
Have we been scripted?
Well, not really, no. So I'm sure everybody sitting here is going, this is great. This sounds really awesome. Let's break the mold. Let's go out. Hopefully, we're all going to be fired up. What is the ROI to the client? Because I feel like that's the other question, the other side, where we have to be fiscally responsible for what we're doing as well, too, right? So again, I'll open it up. I'm not going to volunteer anybody this time. But if anybody just has thoughts on what is the benefit of doing foresight with clients that they might want to share.
I think it's that they're actively participating in creating their future rather than being faced with uncertainty and having to either react or be disrupted by it. So that you are empowering them to create their own future rather than be disrupted by change.
Such a good answer.
Yeah.
Man.
I like that. If you do what you always do, you'll get what you always have gotten. And I think at a time actually now where people need to shift, our world needs to shift. If you look at any of the things our communities are facing, sustainability, it's not enough to actually do what we've been doing. And so I think, for me, the ROI has got to be, getting there quicker. It's that accelerated serendipity and actually saying, listen, you want actually a better outcome. Everyone wants more profit, or they want more productivity, or they want more density. Whatever it is, I think it's this is the way to stretch the rubber band. Art Gensler, I love this. Actually, I thought he was really an interesting person, but always say to us, teach us actually, the role of designers at Gensler was to take the rubber band and stretch it, right? That's what he said. This is foresight, and you got to make sure you don't actually stretch that rubber band until you break it, because that's not foresight. And I always love the idea, with every client and with every actually endeavor, you're trying to stretch that rubber band, and that's the ROI.
Yep.
I love the example of IFTF had an exhibit at the Smithsonian, I think about a year and a half ago. It was the Futures exhibit. And they actually did research and data, and they collected from young folks who actually at the beginning said, we can't see ourselves in the future at all. We actually think that it's incredibly doomsday future. It's a doomsday cycle. We don't see a future amidst, eco-anxiety and all these other, major world issues that we're trying to solve for, right? And so what was incredible was that as soon as they came across these artifacts of the future and, seeing and being able to visualize and have that emotional connection, 77% said that they felt enabled to take action for the future and that they were able to take steps today that could actually change that. And so I think hope is the ROI. That is the ROI, is being able to use design as a champion to instill hope, and that's the goal.
I just want to say one thing. Exactly what she said. There's a brilliant designer called Stefan Stagmeister, and he has a show right now in New York City at Patrick Parrish Gallery, and it is all about that idea. And the idea behind it is, he said, if we think it's so terrible now, in 1910, 7 out of every 10 children died. They actually did not live, and it's a very optimistic look at the future. So.